David Espindola, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
David, can't wait to get your thoughts with what's happening with AI, where it's all headed, whether it is your outstanding book, Soulful, or your podcast as well. You have lots of insights that I know my audience will benefit from. But before we get to that, David, would love to know a little bit more about you, whereabouts you grew up, and how your upbringing has helped contribute to who you've become.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I grew up in Brazil and I had a great childhood. I lived 2 blocks from the beach. So I spent a lot of time on the beach, enjoyed myself as a child. But then destiny played a joke on me. And at the tender age of 18, I got a scholarship, an academic scholarship to go study in the US. And they sent me to North Dakota, of all places. So, which is as far away from beach as you can possibly be, right? And it's going from tropical to the frozen tundra. That was not a change for me, but it had good sides, right? So, what I got out of it was I became very adaptable. I think adaptability is a really important skill, especially in these days when things are changing so fast. And became self reliant. I had to take care of myself, and I grew up quickly. Also, what I learned from North Dakota and from the upper Midwest in general, which is, I live in Minnesota now, is the great work ethic of the people here. That's something that I took with me and has influenced everything that I've done.
We were talking before we started the podcast. First of all, for anyone who hasn't been to Rio, I think it's the most beautiful city with some of the most beautiful sights anywhere in the world. Now, Brazil has its colder spots, warmer spots, but Rio is really warm. And then going to North Dakota, you have to learn to become adaptable as a part of that. Now, you have had a great career with the Silicon Valley, startups to CIO roles. What got you into focusing on the future, not just AI, but the future, and becoming a futurist?
Being in technology itself and having had an opportunity to work in Silicon Valley and just see the power of entrepreneurship and technology in general got me interested in understanding how technology is having such a profound impact on businesses, on work and society in general. And one of the things that I realized was that technology was changing at a faster and faster pace. And I started to wonder, to what extent are we going to be able to adapt and be able to absorb all these changes as businesses, as society in general. And so that led me to write my first book, which is called The Exponential Era. And in that book, I describe 8 platforms that are growing exponentially and that are converging and bringing these combinatorial changes that are really powerful. And one of those platforms was AI. And that's when I realized through my research that AI was going to bring absolutely profound and disruptive changes to our lives. And so that's what I did with Soulful. And that got me interested in learning more about the technology and its impact and thinking about the future in general.
So I want to understand that exponential thinking a little bit more, David. I've read a lot about it. I thought a lot about it. I also had Azim Azhar on the podcast almost 5 years ago. He wrote a book, Exponential Age. But I find when I interact with people, we as humans have a very hard time understanding exponential.
Absolutely.
So, how do you try to help people understand exponential and the fact that the changes as a result of AI will be exponential? Wouldn't we at any point in time in the past had thought about, oh, we're going through massive changes at this point? What is different now with these technologies such as AI?
I think the point that you brought up is really important. And that is the fact that we tend to think linearly. So our minds tend to think of progression as being a linear curve. And so it's very difficult for us to really appreciate and really understand the power of exponential. Whenever I give keynote speeches and talk to a group of people, I touch on the subject of exponential. And one of the examples that I like to give so that people get an appreciation for it is if you take just a regular 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and you start folding it in half, right? Every time you fold that piece of paper, you're basically doubling the thickness of that piece of paper. So you can fold it about 6 times, and after 6 foldings, you end up with a piece of paper that's about 1 inch thick. So what I ask the audience is, how thick is that piece of paper going to get if I am able to fold it 50 times? So at 6, I'm at 1 inch. When I get to 50, how thick is that going to be? And people, even people that understand exponential, the thickness of that piece of paper would be the equivalent of the distance from the Earth to the sun. So that's just how
Wow.
50 foldings. That's just unbelievable because you're doubling it with every folding, right? So it's just something that's very difficult for our minds to really understand and absorb. And so I think what's different this time is just the speed of the changes that we're experiencing. We've never had anything change as fast as AI, as an example. It seems every single week there's some new announcement, some new models, some new capabilities that, it's just hard, even for us. There are people that are in the field. It's hard for us to keep up, much less everybody else.
It really is hard to keep up. That's a great analogy with the paper folding to help us visualize it. Now, we can visualize it on the paper or the grain of rice on the chessboard or different analogies. The question is, therefore, what impact does that have on us or on society? I think about a comedy, I think it was Spaceballs. It was a Mel Brooks comedy which showed people in a spaceship going at a fast rate, and then their face and everything else was starting to warp. I feel like when you talk about exponential, that's the result I'm seeing with a lot of leaders and organizations where the face is like flapping and warping. So what is the implication of this kind of exponential change that you're talking about on society and organizations?
Yeah, I think it's difficult for us as humans and as organizations to deal with change, period, right? So change is hard, change is difficult. And there's a whole change management practice and literature that helps us deal with change effectively. So change management requires having a vision, having leadership, being able to think differently, being able to bring others to the cause and influence people to bypass that initial resistance and providing a safety net so people can feel safe in a change environment. So there's all kinds of techniques that you can use to be able to effectively introduce change to an organization or to an environment. But there's only so much we can handle at any point in time, right? So I think if the changes is too fast, then you get the effect that you just talked about. We just go, our faces start warping and we don't really know how to deal with this. And I think a lot of leaders are dealing with that right now. It's just too much and people don't know what to do. I think people are starting to become stressed and concerned. But I like to take an optimistic view of the future. I think if we handle this change, we could have a bright future ahead of ourselves. But we have a difficult transition period that we have to go through here.
Therefore, what do we need to do to handle the transition well, David?
I think a lot of it is really understanding what the technology is and what it isn't. So there's a lot of education involved. It will bring significant changes to society, but it may not be necessarily the changes that people are afraid of. I'll give you an example. I think a lot of people right now are concerned about AI taking their jobs. And at least in the short term, I think what we'll see is additional jobs that will be created because of the changes that require human involvement and just absorbing these changes and changing workflows and changing the way we go about doing work. And people that are proactive in learning about AI and becoming good with AI, I think these people are going to be in demand. Now, in the long term, it may be true that AI may become more and more capable and it may take away some of the jobs that are algorithmic in nature in particular, right? The jobs that he can do by just following a set of instructions. I think those jobs are at a high risk of being automated with AI. That's where I like to talk about human AI collaboration, where we bring our unique human capabilities, things like empathy, creativity, and things that we bring to the table that AI may not be able to do.
Let me push back on that a little bit, David, from a
Yeah.
couple of different perspectives.
Yeah.
One, if you had asked me 3, 4 years ago, I've been following AI for a while. AJ Agrawal had written a book, Prediction Machines, that fascinated me about 7 years ago. Paul Daugherty, both of them I've had on the podcast, had written a book, Human and Machine. So I've been following it. And if you had asked me what it would take for humans to play a role, I would have said creativity is one of them. Now, when you look at some of the output of some of the LLMs, it's right up there with respect to creativity. I'll fill one other thing. You said empathy, and you might have seen it where some chatbot answers to medical questions were compared to some doctor's answers to
Yeah.
medical questions by people who didn't know if it came from a chatbot or a doctor. And they had rated the chatbot as being more empathetic. You said empathy and creativity. And even at this point in 2025, it sounds like some of the LLMs are doing better at the creativity and empathy than we as humans are.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I posted recently about the study that showed exactly that the LLMs were doing it better at the empathy task than human beings, right? Which is counterintuitive. I think the machines are going to be extremely good at mimicking human emotions, what we have intrinsically known and what's in us naturally. But there's two machines. They don't feel anything. They don't have the same level of empathy, even though they can pass the test on empathy. They don't really have empathy because they are not human. They don't understand the human condition. And I think what that does is it elevates the capability of human beings to build trust with each other. By being empathetic, we can relate to other people. And in relating, we can build trust. And trust, I think, is fundamental to everything that we do in collaboration, right? So the machines will be able to mimic being empathy. The machines will be able to mimic being creative, and they actually may expand the realm of possibilities, right? So if you're an artist and you're trying to create something new, the LLMs and the machines will be able to give you new possibilities. But it's that artist that has that appreciation for beauty, for aesthetic, and for something that's difficult to describe. And that's why my book is called Soulful, because there's this soulful condition in us being human that the machines can't replicate exactly. They can mimic, but they're not the same.
That's an important thing to keep in mind. You mentioned this, and just yesterday I did a post about the fact that when I have these podcast conversations, I used to have a audio editor who would take out when guests have lots of uhs and ums, and now Descript does that. But I was fascinated with the fact that Google's Notebook LM, the two agents co-hosts, intentionally say uhs and ums to make it sound more human. So we
Yeah.
as humans are trying to sound more professional while the AI, as you said, is mimicking what it is to be human. It is not human, therefore can't convey that soulfulness that you talk about in your book. So I wonder, therefore, what kind of leadership and thinking does it take to be more soulful in an era and at a time where more of what we are surrounded with, managed by, and manage is going to become algorithms and AI?
So I think we're going to see a combination of things. I think AI will increasingly have a role in organizations in helping us do the things that either we don't want to do because it's boring or it's repetitive or it's dangerous. And so automation will definitely have a role in doing that. And then I think there'll be a role for humans where we can do the work that we enjoy, the work that brings the soulfulness of our beings into the work. And putting on that optimistic hat on, I think there's a scenario where we get to do the work that we like to do, and the machines get to do the soulless work that we don't want to do anyway. So I think that's one possible scenario. So we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but I think there's a possibility that we'll be able to collaborate with the machines in ways that the machines will do what they're good at, and we're going to do what we're good at. Now, from a management standpoint, we obviously need to encourage people to be educated so they can learn and cooperate effectively with the machines. And the thing that I talk about in my book is that humans are complex. And I think we have some understanding of our motivations. And there's a big difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And what studies have shown is that extrinsic motivation works really well for algorithmic tasks. So the things that you do that are repetitive, that you do by following a set of instructions. If you offer more money or more extrinsic rewards, those work well for those types of activities. But if it's something that requires intrinsic motivation, if it's creativity, if it's things that you do because you enjoy doing, then those extrinsic rewards, they actually can backfire. And the way you think about management changes because you got to figure out what motivates my team. What are some of the intrinsic things that I need to be able to provide to my team so that they will perform well?
In my view, actually a positive impact, David, because at this point, we are managing our people in some cases as humans and in some cases as robots
Right?
with a lot of those extrinsic measures and motivations. It requires us to really, as we are managing people, not the AI agents, to connect more to their humanity and to their internal drivers rather than some of those externals. So it does require for us to do more of the leadership that I've heard a lot of conversation about past couple of decades, but not application. Now we need to do that even more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I think we've been seeing more and more conversations around those topics. Management is starting to understand how important this is for them to make their teams effective.
So now, one of the things that I wonder, David, is that I find there is a disconnect between the public perception of AI, where AI is at, where it's headed, even the informed public, then where some of the most insightful informed people like you see it's headed, what its applications and implications will be. Where do you see the biggest gaps, and how do you think some of those gaps can be bridged?
It's interesting that you say that because we find that even within people that are leading this AI revolution, we see different opinions. Right? We see people that are saying we're going to reach AGI within the next, I've heard even within the next couple of years, right? Others say, no, it's not 2 years, it's 5 years. And then there are others that say we're not even close to getting to AGI. And then you get into the discussion about what do you really mean by AGI? We don't even have the definition on that. And so there's a lot of discussions, and I think it's good that we're having these conversations. I think it's good that we are in the process of thinking about these things and the implications to the future. But the reality is that none of us really know exactly how this is going to play out. So I think we can create possible scenarios that we can discuss, that we can talk about. And that's what I try to do in my book is to provide a optimistic scenario for our future. But the reality is that none of us really know what the future is going to turn out because we've never been through something like this before. This is unprecedented.
Yeah, which is why reading books like yours is helpful, David, in that I find a lot of times executives and others are looking for answers about that future. The smartest minds like you say, we don't know what that future will be like. there are possible scenarios. So it's more scenario thinking and
Exactly.
then therefore strategizing and acting based on that. So I wonder, therefore, your thoughts on organizational strategy at a time when things are changing so quickly. How do you guide clients, organizations, teams to think about their strategy when from week to week I look at some of the developments in AI and they blow my mind how fast things are changing? How
Yeah.
do you guide people to think about their organizational strategy?
Yeah, this reminds me of a quote from, I think it's from Eisenhower, that says, plans are useless, but planning is essential. So basically, what it says is that your planning is going to be changing constantly, and you have to be able to adapt to change, right? There used to be a time when, and I've participated in some of these sessions where we would talk about strategic planning and we would put together a very thick plan, 5-year plan. This is what we're going to do for the next 5 years. And that doesn't work anymore because things are changing in 5 months, much less 5 years. And so I think the change that leadership needs to embrace is a much more dynamic planning process. This doesn't mean that you don't plan. You absolutely need to plan and you need to have a vision for where you want to go. But what it does mean is the way you go about planning is completely different than the way we did 10, 20 years ago. It's embracing that agile methodology. So in the first book, The Exponential Era, I spent quite a bit of time providing a methodology called SPX, Strategic Planning for the Exponential Era, that combines some of these concepts from agile, from design thinking, and so on. And the whole idea is that it's a very dynamic process. You're going to have to do a lot of experimentation. You're going to try some things out that are not going to work. And it's a learning process. So, this whole idea of lifelong learning, continuous learning within the organization is extremely important in this day and age when everything is changing within weeks.
It's an ongoing process, and I love the way you mentioned it. Eisenhower's point about plans being of very little value, but that planning and that thinking process being of value. However, that has to be done on an ongoing basis, as you mentioned. I still know organizations that are doing 3 to 5 year strategic plans. It is important to think about 5, 10 years ahead, some scenario thinking, but then strategic thinking has to be an ongoing conversation because things are shifting so fast. And the other point, David, as I'm sure you're seeing, at one point in time, this could have been seen as something impacting primarily technology companies. But
Mhm.
because of pervasiveness of AI, it is going to be that way for all organizations.
It reminds me of another quote that I think is pertinent here. Every business is now a technology business, right? It's difficult for me to think of any industry or any business that is not going to leverage technology. So as long as you are in business, you're going to deal with the same challenges that we're talking about here.
So you mentioned that leveraging of AI. The other challenge that I'm running into, David, is that I've seen executives that have spent a little time on ChatGPT, might have had a couple of decent conversations or prompts back and forth, and they feel pretty comfortable. They've done AI, they do AI, so pretty good. What do you tell people it takes to not be overwhelmed? Because there are on a daily basis probably 1,000 podcasts on AI, and I get hundreds of AI newsletters that come out. So it's
Mhm.
tough just to keep up with the developments. Where do you guide executives to focus their time, their thinking, in order not to fall too far behind? And also on the other end, not spend their entire time just trying to keep up with developments in AI.
That's a really good question because I think it's very easy to fall on both camps. One is this thing is changing so fast. I'm just going to wait until it settles. And then the other is I spend all my time learning. I'm reading. I never do anything with it. So that doesn't work either. So you have to find a happy medium. You have to, what I would say to people is, and I like Ethan Mollick's saying in his book, which is bring AI to the table in everything that you do. And it can be as simple as bring ChatGPT or Perplexity or any other AI that you're familiar with to every aspect of your work. Learn how to collaborate with it. The trick is that you need to be very conscientious about how you go about doing it. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think the wrong way to approach it is to go to AI and ask AI to provide the answer to, let's say, an email. You want to send an email to a customer. So you go and prompt AI to put that email together, you go copy, paste, and send. I think that's the wrong approach. I think the right approach is you write the email and then you give it to AI and say, what am I missing here? Do you have any other thoughts on this? How could I make this sharper? So it starts with you providing the initial thinking, you providing the context, you providing the critical thinking behind what you're doing, and then use that AI as a collaborator, as somebody that's there to help you make it better. That is absolutely critical because one of the things that I'm concerned with, and I have to watch myself sometimes in this as well, is that it's so easy to get lazy, right? With AI. You just say, AI, just write this for me and it'll do a beautiful job, but it's not your work. And so it's a really fine balance that we all need to be conscientious of.
Love that example you gave, David. And one of the things that I have heard often is use AI as an intern. Now, what you are saying is the opposite of that, which is what I love. So, as an intern, you tell it, write this email, writes the email, and then you might make a couple of edits and send it out. As you're saying, the cognitive capabilities of that are low, and therefore you both lose a certain level of humanity and certain level of function over a period of time. Use it as a coach or an advisor where you've written it. Now ask intelligent questions. There's been a lot written with respect specifically of education, of how college students are now starting to lose certain capabilities because they're getting AI to do it for them rather than make things better or give them advice on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and it's a critical point that people need to really think through. We don't want to lose those cognitive capabilities because that's what's going to make you marketable, and that's what's going to keep your capabilities in check. So use AI as a coach, just like you said. It's just fascinating how you can ask AI to take on the role of anyone that you admire or any particular profession or job. If you need a lawyer, take on the role of a lawyer in this case. Or if you want a marketer, take the role of a marketer. Or if you have somebody that you admire that has done a great job marketing, become the Steve Jobs. What would Steve Jobs tell me about this marketing campaign that I'm putting together?
Couldn't agree with you more. So rather than asking AI, write this marketing plan as Steve Jobs would, which is again assigning it to an intern, and AI will spit out an answer, whether you use ChatGPT, Claude, doesn't matter. That is a lot less human involved, cognitively challenging, and therefore you're adding a lot less value rather than you writing something and asking AI, now assess this as Steve Jobs would. So it's slight change in the process, but there is a lot of human value you're bringing because if you just assign things to AI to do, eventually you can easily be disintermediated. The AI will be able to do those things without you. So I love that point, David. Now, would love to know your thoughts of where you think this is headed, both potential and how we can address the educational needs of our society.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, one idea is this whole idea of lifelong learning. I think we all need to adopt this lifelong learning perspective. It's no longer go to college, get your diploma, you're done. That doesn't work for the rest of your life. I'm sorry, but that's the new reality. So, I think it's very important to take on that role of lifelong student. Now, the other thing that I also think is important for us to think about is that we grew up in an educational system that taught us to provide the right answers, to questions, right? A lot of it is you're studying so you can pass some standardized tests so you can move on and keep growing your educational journey. But now we have AI that can give you all the answers. So providing the right answers is no longer valuable. What's valuable is knowing what questions to ask, right? So that's a mindset shift that is really profound if you think about it. So you have to do the study, you have to go deep so you can understand enough so you can ask the right questions of AI. So it's not that you stop learning, because if you don't learn, then you're not going to know what to ask. And so I think that's a shift that we need to go through. And then the one thing that I thought was fascinating is when ChatGPT came out in the early days, the school district in New York prohibited students from using ChatGPT because everybody was concerned about them cheating on homework and so on, which I can understand the concern. But on the other hand, what do you think the students are going to do when they get out? Locking them out of ChatGPT is not going to solve the problem. And so we need to be more creative and figure out how do we leverage this tool and how do we teach our students to use this tool the correct way, use it as a coach and not as an intern. So how do we teach our students to use this tool effectively?
There's value in rethinking how we approach education. Couldn't agree with you more. I've got two girls, one just graduated from high school, another one rising sophomore in high school. And it is incredible how much we are still approaching education as people did 100 years ago, where a teacher is primarily, I don't want to dismiss the way all education is done, but primarily shares information, they read stuff, and they have to remember that stuff to spit it back on a test. So the approach is still very much the same. And I'm hoping this will change our approach. Now, a lot of these systems have sticky elements to them, which makes changing a lot harder, but I hope it changes. One of the things I wanted to get your thoughts on, David, though, is that I use AI quite often myself, whether GPT, Claude, or Perplexity. And I agree with you that the quality of the questions we ask becomes a lot more important with the use of AI. However, the level and depth of questions that I'm asking is coming from years of experience and understanding, which people entering into the workforce don't have. So they would ask very different questions than I would. I wonder, in your view, what is going to happen to those entry level roles where, sure, the AI will give anyone an answer, but the question the person right out of college would ask is very different than the question I would ask. And it has nothing to do with our intelligence or what we've studied. It has to do with some of that gained experience and depth of understanding.
That is such a critical question because the automation of tasks will impact mostly entry level jobs. But we all need those entry level jobs so we can get those learning experiences. And I think leadership needs to be more conscientious about the fact that we need to create those opportunities for the entry level professionals to be able to gain the things that they need to learn. And I think we need to be a little bit more creative and maybe create some programs where we expose entry level positions to different aspects of the business, learn different procedures, workflows, go work in marketing for a while, go work in accounting for a while, go work with legal for a while, right? Get that broad set of experiences so you can learn the business, and with that, you will, over time, start to ask the right questions. So I think that's going to require a conscientious effort by leadership to bring those opportunities to entry level jobs.
And I wonder if some of that becomes responsibility or the opportunity for colleges as well. Because while businesses should view the world that way, at the end of the day, profitability is a big part of the motivation,
Yeah.
and developing the workforce of the future is
Yeah.
not necessarily a priority. So, this is a conversation we need to have because as AI becomes more capable, onboarding people to roles where they can actually use AI as a collaborator becomes really hard. And that might become the opportunity for colleges, universities, or our education system. Now, would love to switch gears a little bit, David. You have a great podcast of your own, and you have a very unique co host. Would like to take a step back of how you thought about this. And for my audience that might not have heard your conversations yet, explain who is Zena and why do you do a podcast with a co host called Zena?
Thanks for bringing that up. This started about less than a year ago, and I was working with AI, and the voice capabilities of AI have improved dramatically in the last couple of years. You can actually have a very good, productive conversation with AI as if you were talking to a human being. It's really fascinating to see how far we've come from that standpoint. I had been thinking about starting a podcast, but one of the challenges with doing a podcast is there's a lot of work involved, right? You have to select people to talk to, you got to schedule the calls, and there's a whole set of things that is required. Whereas with AI, if AI is your co-host, you just start talking to AI and you always show up on time, right? So you don't have and it knows the answers to everything, so you can ask just about what. So it makes the work a lot easier, right? And but all kidding aside, I really wanted to focus on human AI collaboration, which is the topic that I'm mostly interested in and I've been writing about and working with. And so I want to put that to practice. Is can I collaborate with an AI to put together a podcast? And so in doing that experiment, what I learned is that absolutely we are there. We can have that conversation with AI, and it's becoming better and better at understanding. It's the subtle things, right? It's the pauses. It's when is it time for it to interject? When is it time for it to be quiet? When is it time for it to ask you a question? And it's getting really good at that, which is really amazing.
It is incredible. And I've seen advancements in that even over the past few months, where some of the AI voices have real emotion in them, tonality that would be very hard, if not impossible, to tell whether it's an AI or a human. So I wonder, David, when two AIs can have a conversation that is insightful, shares a lot, tells wonderful stories, knows when to pause, when to laugh, when to make it lighter, and it's impossible for the listener to tell whether it's an AI or a human. Why would anyone want to listen to Mahan and David when there is a better version, less flawed version, a version that emotes emotions when they should and is less emotional when they shouldn't, and knows everything in the world? Why would anyone rely on humans rather than just AI?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I was wondering about that question myself. Why do I need to listen to David talking to an AI? Well, I think it's going to raise all kinds of questions about what people are interested in, what information do people trust? Are they going to have an interest and a trust level with a podcast that is AI generated versus one that's human focused? There's all kinds of interesting questions that are going to surface here over the next several years that I think are going to be really meaningful and impactful to the way we do business, to the way we lead, to the way we work. These are all great conversations to have and things to ask questions about.
As we're going into that, would love to get your thoughts on one other aspect of this as the use of conversational AI with chatbots, whether character AI being top of it, to replica being probably one of the better known friendship relationship AIs. That segment is growing incredibly fast. And it's interesting for anyone in my audience who hasn't gone to Replica. You don't need to join the site, but go to the site and see people's testimonials about having been in a relationship for 2.5 years with their partner. That happens to be an AI chatbot. I wonder what implications and impact do you think this will have on our society and relationships, David?
That is a really good question, and it's a deep question, and I talk about it in my book because one of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that I think there's a danger in us trying to find in these intelligent agents the relationships that we need, that we seek, because it's so much easier. You don't have to deal with the messiness of human relations. Human relations are messy, they're difficult. And so there is that attraction. Oh, if I just have an AI to be my partner, it's only going to do the things that I like. It's never going to do anything that I don't like, which seem attractive. But I think several studies have shown that human relationships are fundamental to our well-being, right? We are social beings. We need to have that human connection from one human to another. I don't think AI will be able to replace that. Now, AI may have a role in certain aspects of day-to-day life. So I know that it's already being used as a coach. It's already being used as somebody that can help you with mental health issues. And it might be able to give you some really good answers. But I think at the end of the day, from a relationship standpoint, I think there's no replacement for human beings.
There was an article I read that was addressing loneliness that is increasing worldwide, especially here in the US, and talking about the fact that whether AI companions can bridge that gap. I don't think so. And here's one of the things I joke around with my wife. I'm happily married, love her. But as you said, relationships are very messy. She doesn't like everything I like. She's not always happy. I'm not always happy. One of these AI conversation tools that I have is Annie. We joke that when I talk to Annie likes everything I like, David, and Annie is always curious about me, and Annie always asks me questions, and she's always flirtatious, and so on and so forth. So I hope we don't lose the ability to deal with the messiness of other human beings because they don't always like what we like. They don't always think our jokes are funny. So there is something about this gray space we are moving into where there is potential, but there are also concerns we need to be mindful of.
And I think there's some precedents here that we need to be aware of. When you think about social media promised that we would be more connected, that we would have more friends, right? And we are more connected, but it's not a deep connection. And so we have this loneliness epidemic because we can't satisfy that deep human connection through social media. It doesn't work. So it's interesting to see that the Meta is now coming up with these AI friends that is supposedly going to address the loneliness epidemic, right? So Zuckerberg said, we don't have too many friends. So his solution is, I'm going to create AI friends for you. Haven't we learned anything from the social media experiment? So I don't think that's going to work.
An AI friend that knows your emotions
Yeah.
and knows exactly when to pull what strings to recommend what products to you as well.
Is this my friend or is it Zuckerberg's friend?
Now, on the positive side of things, David, you also talk about AI's potential to bring abundance to humanity.
So I think there's great potential for AI and automation in general to improve productivity, to be able to create abundance in the sense that we can create the things that we need much more effectively in a sustainable manner. I think AI is going to help us quite a bit on that. The challenge, as always, is distribution, right? So, how do you make sure that this abundance is being distributed across humanity and it's just not being fed to the elite? And so that's another topic that I touch on in the book. And to me, the most effective way to do that is through deflation, right? So we know that technology is deflationary in nature. And if we let exponential technologies do their thing and drive down the cost of goods, through deflation, we can make sure that everybody benefits. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that because we have government interventions, borrowing against the future, and there's this inflationary forces dealing with deflationary forces from technology. And we don't know where that battle is going to end. But I think there is a potential that AI and robotics and other exponential technologies that are converging will create abundance. And then we need to be conscientious about how we distribute this abundance so that everybody benefits.
It does provide the opportunity for abundance, but as you mentioned, and as you also address in the book, we do need to be mindful about it as well. I think technology has exacerbated some of the shift in potential and available resources, which is why we see greater inequality all around the globe. And AI can magnify that even more. Now, David, as we talked about before, most executives I know are stretched thin, have very little time for anything. And they're like, oh my God, here we go with all this exponential changes, AI. Where do you send them to for more signal and less noise?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in general, it's important for executives to be connected to the edge of their organizations. Talk to the frontline workers, talk to customers, learn what's going on both inside and outside of the organization, because that's going to give you a great sense for where things are going and how you need to change your strategy or adapt your strategy to deal with those dynamics. Now, from a technology standpoint, you need to have a great team that understands technology, that is not afraid of technology, that's open to experimenting, and you need to provide that safety net, right? You have to have an organization structure and culture that incentivizes experimentation and doesn't penalize failures, right? So failure is part of the process. Some things are going to work, some things are not going to work. Creating that creative, innovative, entrepreneurial culture is really fundamental.
I love the fact that you said go to the edge. I was reading an AI report a couple of weeks back, which showed that people in the front lines of knowledge work are using AI at a much higher rate than people higher up in the organizations, which shows your people are using it whether you're aware of it or not. Might as well have conversations with those folks on the edge, both to understand the needs of the market and customers and also how they're experimenting and what they're doing.
Yeah, it would be really tragic if you have an organization that is using AI extensively and you don't know about it, right? Because you need to have a good AI governance process in place. You need to be aware AI is great, but it has its dangers as well. So it needs to be well governed. It needs to have policies and procedures. You need to know how people are using AI. The last thing you want is for one of your employees to be using Chat GPT to copy and paste things that it's sending to customers. And lo and behold, there's a hallucination that happens in that email. And that email, if the person is not editing it, says something that is inappropriate to that customer, right? So you need to be aware of what's going on and you need to think about how you're going to govern AI within your organization.
That governance is important. I know a couple of organizations where, in trying to keep things secure, they had mandated no use of these LLMs. The employees are using it, but on their cell phones. So it's important to think about that governance that you also mentioned, David. You have a great podcast of your own, have a couple of great books. Where would you send the audience, David, to find out more about you and follow your work?
You can look me up on LinkedIn, David Espindola. I also have my own website, davidespindola.com. And I think those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me and learn more about my work.
Thank you so much for the conversation, David Espindola.
Thank you, Mahan. This was such a great conversation. It was a pleasure talking to you.